Hello, and welcome back to another episode of the Critical Fools podcast. This is episode number 81. And this week we have one of my, I think, favorite movies over the last 2 years that I've seen, at least. And that is The Banshees of Inisherin, which was released, and I'm trying to remember, I think it was in 2022. It's been out a couple years now. But I just thought this was my pick, and I thought the subject matter was pretty interesting. And it's kind of a lot to discuss. So, yeah, Chris, I kind of wanted to get your initial thoughts on this movie.
I don't think there's enough. There's a lot to discuss.
There's a good amount and some interesting themes.
There's more to discuss than some of our more
some other movies we picked.
Yeah, more to
anyway,
discuss.
I
would say at a high level, I had watched this, I think, the winter of 23. So it's been some time. I obviously the cast. I think initially what drew me to watching this was the trailer and the cast drew me to the trailer, which is then why I watched it that winter. It stars Colin Farrell and Brendan Gleeson, and I think those are the main two that are super famous. Yeah, actually, Brad.
They have another up and comer who's getting on.
Barry? How do you say his last name?
Keoghan, something like that.
Yeah.
And I might be mispronouncing.
He's more famous for dating the superstar singer. But anyways,
he's had a lot of pretty big roles of late. I think he's just getting a lot more traction in Hollywood.
And actually, Gleeson is in a film that I've considered doing for this pod, which I might revisit maybe next year or later this year. It's underrated indie film he was in. It's Catholicism is a big theme in that one, so that's why it's on my radar. But going back to this film, yeah, so I would say high level, like I think, that's what drew me in. Once I started watching it, I was like, this is gonna be a wild ride. That's what I started realizing after the first 20 minutes, when like just the level set, for the audience, like the premises of this film is these are two lifelong friends. And I think that's one of the important themes of this film is friendship, especially male friendship, I think. And we'll get into the reasons why. I'm going to now go by the characters' names. Calm and Podrick they stop communicating, but he tells him to show him that he's serious, that every time he talks to him, he's going to cut off one of his fingers and send it to him. And at first, actually, this is where I give credit to the movie. I didn't know that was like him being very serious about it or not, because he is at least Calm views himself as an artist,
musician,
and a thinker like basically like somebody who would deal with the gray. But you learn, for the matter of fact, that like he is definitely serious, and it throws off Podrick because literally they were talking the other day, and then it wasn't the normal, like, I get it, right? The normal, even in today's society with social media and texting, like you get that natural, like, you try to hang out a few times and then it doesn't happen, and then you just slowly drift. This was like immediate. So definitely I understand why I threw him off. And throughout the film, there's other subplots, right? There is the, Dominic's, who is the actor you just boosted his resume on, and his subplot of his, like, I think dealing with male loneliness. I think that's why it's gonna be an interesting conversation, because I think this film, one of the more important themes is like male loneliness, friendship. There's other sub themes as well, but like legacy and like how you view maybe the difference between how you view yourself and how others view you. And to give you a concrete example, that I think there's a scene earlier in the film where Podrick's sister Shaban confronts Colm about like, why are you ignoring my brother, and he says, because he's dull. And she says, well, he's always been dull. Right. And what's only changed for him is that he now is getting older and realizes that maybe, his life has been kind of meaningless. And I think that's going to be an interesting topic too, of like how one views their life. So yeah, I would say at a high level, I thought that was really interesting. This is why it's one of the better movies, I think, in recent memory. Obviously the acting is great and the writing is good. And I think there's other backdrop too, with, the Irish Civil War that's happening on a different island. And I don't think it's meant to be like a movie about like the Irish Civil War, but I think that's meant to be used as like a metaphor of what's going on this other and the plot we're following. But yeah, I'm not surprised that you picked this film and you liked it, because I have some films in my backlog where I literally think like, oh, my co-host would definitely like it. It's more of a it's more of a thinker's. I mean, I like thinkers films too, but you know, what I mean, I like going to the extreme thinkers where you don't understand anymore what's going on.
Yeah. I like this, and then you want the abstract meta.
Yeah, I want to. What is my reality? Yeah.
Which I have a couple films like that we might get into.
Yeah.
So we'll see.
Yeah, I mean, Stalker is one of my favorites, as you know. But anyways, I'm curious. So, like,
I guess hold on. There's also New York Schenectady. That might have been the biggest one.
That's I still to this day don't understand the film, and that's why it's so brilliant.
But you told me, you're like, it finally clicked in the last 20 minutes, and you're like, I don't think I've ever cried in a film before. Like
yeah, it was like clicked. It started clicking. I was like, such a beautiful film. But yeah, this one gives me like it's like it has onions to it. That's what I noticed with some of your favorite picks, is that there's layers to it. So like when I think of Annihilation, I think of Sound of Metal. I don't know, you could have easily been like, you know what, my favorite movie is
I do love Tokyo Drift. That is one of my favorites.
Yeah, that's basic storyline. Yeah, that's a good one. Yeah, that's a basic storyline.
It's just such nostalgia for me, and I love, like, when I was a kid seeing drifting, I was like, this is so cool. I wish I could do that, but I can't. I'm not ever doing that.
Well, don't worry. I'll have some basic picks for you. We'll do that recent. What's her name? Cindy Sweeney film. We'll do that one eventually, dude.
Okay. Yeah. Anyway,
okay,
I do agree. I thought the casting was very good in this film, like the acting from Colin Farrell all the way to Perry Keoghan and Brendan Gleeson. I really like the pace. Like, it was kind of a consistent pace. It seemed a little slow at times, but I think it really added to kind of the aesthetic or feeling of the film. I think if it was too fast, you kind of not get the feeling of loneliness calling from Colin and kind of vengeance. But I think it was interesting because I think another theme in this film is kind of rejection. You had Colin kind of getting rejection from the male perspective with his lifelong friend, with Brendan, or with Colin. And then at the same time, he still had the other plot of Dominic, who kept trying to ask Siobhan out, who was Podrick's sister. And he ultimately, like, she keeps like thwarting his advances. She's like, you're too young, things like that. And ultimately, it was kind of sad because I remember the part where I was like, dang, there's just like so much heartbreak with Podrick, because he loses his friend, he loses his donkey to one of the fingers, which causes a bunch of vengeance. And then later he loses the only other friend he kind of had, which was Dominic, when they find his body drowned in the pond. So it's like it was really sad because it's like, dang, you lose everything. And then at that point, you totally know that Podrick is completely lonely. And that's when he writes his letter to Siobhan, who also had left to the mainland, Ireland. And he was kind of like totally isolated at that point. So I thought it was interesting. It was sad. It was, like you said, it had a lot of layers to this movie. And it was just kind of an interesting directorial approach they took to it. Yeah, I don't know. Was there any other scenes you really wanted to touch upon with this movie? It was not super complicated.
There's a lot of good scenes. Yeah. So
the donkey was just so tragic. That's obviously the one that people really talk about.
That's a good point about. I knew about the vengeance thing. I was gonna bring that up, but that's a good point about rejection too. But taking a step back, I think one thing it would be interesting to discuss is, like, I guess, each other's perspectives on maybe each of those topics, but
sure,
and maybe through some of the scenes. So Dominic's character, like I said, it's probably the third most important character. Actually, no, it's the fourth, because Siobhan's they're probably tied. Probably.
Yeah, it's hard because there's a lot of, like, he's very important in this movie too.
Yeah, he's probably tied with Siobhan. We know who the main two are, but like, so what's interesting, I said, like, clever writing, right? We're able to piece together through dialogue, which is, again, this is a great. It's funny. I have that rule of, like, show don't tell, but this is, they tell you, but they kind of tell you in a way where it's not like directly like a monologue, right? We learned through dialogue that he was probably abused by his father, and like he did not have a good upbringing, and he's searching for.
Well, but then also Podrick accuses him, and he also finds that was a weird scene when he finds his father naked there. I was like, this is like when it's getting wild. And
Yeah,
obviously, he's traumatized to a degree by his dad.
yeah, and so we are able to get some color into his, let's say, destroyed psyche. Also, there is this other lady. I mean, she's not as important with dialogue, but it's
The older lady.
the Mrs. McCormick. She's like
Mhm.
this almost like pseudo sightseer.
Yeah.
She's able. She typical prophecy type of folks where like they say like typical Greek style where like they say a prophecy that does become true when you retrospectively, um, you know, realize that it was basically like it was true, but it was not in the way you anticipated
Yep.
it to be.
There's a twist.
That was very Greek-like, where it's like, oh, there will be death on this island, and you're like, oh, it was this person's death, not the one I was probably thinking.
Yeah.
The Greeks were always famous for that. But yes, I will say that. Oh yes, because I wanted to bring up is that like because I think it's easier to go from bottom to up in this movie. So like because Shaban's and Dominic's characters are a bit easier to talk about, then we can get into the main two. But yeah,
Sure.
so Dominic has these issues with parenthood, like his father, romantic inclinations, and then obviously even maybe some version of male friendship. I think there is a part in the movie where Dominic and Podrick do have a falling out because of how Podrick treated this other character.
Yeah, I forgot who it was, but yeah, they do have a.
Declan, because Podrick is jealous of Calm talking to somebody else, right? He's like, well, why him and not me, right? But yeah, what I wanted to ask you was that, like, to me, Dominic's character, I don't know if the director and writer are going for this. It just reminded me a lot of like almost critiquing or not critiquing, but maybe giving some analysis of some of our, let's just say, isolated. I don't want to use the word, so I'm going to avoid using the word
No, go ahead.
incel. But I felt like that's what that part. Dominic's character was really not. I don't want to say critique. I'm going to say it's an analysis of that kind of
I think
archetype.
kind of a dive into that kind of psyche to a degree.
Yeah, where
Obviously Dominic's character is a bit traumatized and stunted, really, in his development. I think partly because of a lot of the trauma that his dad caused him.
yeah,
Right. It's probably trying to go on because, like, he was always so awkward. Didn't really know how to talk to Siobhan. Didn't really know how to talk to people, really. And he was always just very awkward character, unfortunately. But you kind of empathize with him over what he's gone through, and then in the end, you see him ultimately drowned, which was very tragic. So I don't think they were. I think it was kind of a dive into that psyche to a degree, but I don't know if it was fully trying to comment on it.
I think it was trying to comment. My perspective is it was trying to comment on, like, and I think in an empathetic way of like we tend to want to, in our society, want to demonize them, like, oh, these are just losers. But actually, I think what they're trying to say is that we should have empathy because you just said it. Their emotional growth is stunted. That last phase didn't happen for them for whatever reason, whether that's parenthood or like they just didn't socialize as teenagers or whatever. And like instead of viewing them as like, oh, these are just guys that live in basements and they can't talk to other people, or especially women very well, we should have a little more of an understanding. I almost, in many ways, this movie is very dark, but I came away thinking sometimes that the movie was trying to use that darkness to get you to think, to be more empathetic to like some of these experiences versus like, oh, that's just a guy who's a loser listening to this, misogynistic content. Like, that's why he's a loser. It's like, because I've heard this from some people, like, oh, they're losers because they listen to this content, but they don't realize that they listen to this content because they feel the certain way often, and then that feeds them, and they're in the cycle. You know me, I love cycles. That's
why you like the upstream color.
I love that movie, dude. Love that movie. Everything connects, dude. I truly do believe that everything does connect. And I just see a lack of like empathy, but also a lack of like even like big picture thinking. It's like, do you think, like, just like Podrick, he's not waking up being like, I want to feel this way, I want to be miserable. He's trying to change it, and the only mechanisms that he can somehow in his brain. So I think, like, to your point, he's not understanding Shaban's rejections, but he's also trapped thinking that, oh, this is one of the
Dominic, right?
Yeah, like he's trapped because I think in his perspective also is like, well, this is the only kind of girl that's kind of nice to me, doesn't treat me like a dog.
Yeah.
So therefore it confuses it with not like empathy and like, friendship type of thing, but like, oh, she must be into me.
Yeah.
I see that a lot.
Well,
I
I
see
think
that. I see that with a lot with younger dudes. It's kind of freaked me out. Where like, oh, she's into me because she was nice to me. I'm like, that's dude, man.
yeah, I think
You got a
dudes
lot to
sometimes draw
learn,
that
bro.
line a little too much. But it's also, I think part of it is like, I think with his emotional growth, he's not able to parse that out.
Yeah.
Is just not developed in that way to be able, or like doesn't have enough experiences to be able to like understand that over time. I think that's like a big issue, right? You kind of learn from experiences, and I just don't think, right, especially because it's a small town. So obviously, just like socially kind of like hindered in a way, in many ways, right? And so like even he just doesn't really know how to read a lot of situations, and that's not just with Shaban. You could argue that with almost every interaction that he has in this movie. He does have some understanding, to your point, when he has that falling out and he calls out Podrick for his bad behavior, right? But that was one of the only instances, and maybe they're trying to show that over time he actually is having some growth. But overall, through most of the film, he really doesn't know how to handle a lot of social interactions, especially with Shaban.
Yeah. Yeah, I find it interesting because I think like it's a movie, so people are able to take a third degree view. But I've seen this so many times where just people who are like Podrick, I mean, if they ended up dead like him, they just wouldn't blink an eye because they're just like, okay, that was a
If
excess
they
of
ended up
society.
what?
Like if they ended up dead, like I think a lot of people who I know don't think much of the incel community would be cheering. It's just very. I give the movie credit because it's hard to create empathy in the character that I think a lot of people, if they were to the situation presented differently, I know their reviews would have been, oh yeah, this guy's a typical misogynistic creep that needs to be done with. I mean, that's unfortunately how bad our rhetoric in our current society. I'm trying to connect everybody with our current society, and it's
To
unfortunate how
your
bad.
point, though, what you were saying earlier with Dominic, yeah, you do see that sometimes with dudes who they just confuse or blur the two, and it's like, no, sometimes people are just being nice, and there's not really much beyond this.
Yeah. But I liked your point about tying it with rejection. I think like what ends up happening is that a normal person after let's say I give you the second time as a everybody maybe misreads it, everybody's done this like you and me. I bet I can speak to this. Okay, but I think you're right. After like the insistence, I was like, man, dude, this is tough to watch sometimes, bro. You gotta like I know some girls say they want to play hard to get, but at a certain point, like
Oh
no.
no, she wasn't playing hard to get.
Yeah. So it was like you gotta move on, but I think literally like couldn't because I think not many people were nice to him on the island.
No,
So.
almost no. I mean, you could tell the way they even talked or viewed him, right? And it was interesting that this Podrick was the one at the bar to like point out, and it's like, dude, he basically accuses him. That was also very interesting. I want to get your thoughts on that scene when he grows, and Podrick's obviously a little emotional because Colum doesn't really want anything to do with him. But then he goes in kind of an emotional rage, and then Dominic's dad is there, and he's trying to like he's making fun of doing, and he basically accuses him of molesting his son. And then Colum said that was the most interesting thing that he's done. I wanted to get your thoughts on like, I guess what you thought Colum was thinking at that point. Is it because he just made some observation for the first time?
Yes, but also, you and I don't have this privilege because we grew up in an actual big city. But whenever I talk to my stepdad about his experiences growing up in his small town, like basically a village,
in
like
northern Spain,
not this small, but like it was like 500 people or whatever. He told me once that like the problem with that kind of environment is that like people know everything, but they don't say it. They don't say it, and so I think what Calm was also hinting at there was not only
that he actually had the courage to actually speak up about it.
That was something that nobody else would say, and also it's out of his character, so it ties together, right? Like it's the small town and it's out of his character because he's a dull guy. He's the type of guy, like we've watched the whole movie, right? He's the type of guy that, I guess something weird's happening there, but that's not my business. I'm gonna keep alonging,
Yeah.
Like that's his nature. But because of this new situation,
he broke from what was expected of him.
Exactly. And I think that's what drew Calm to say that comment. But I think it speaks to an environment of like small town where like everybody kind of knows each other's business or has inklings. But like when you're in a big city, like, we grew up, like you're not going to know everything of every person in this city. It's impossible. You're going to know maybe your neighbor.
Like my dad's hometown in Mexico. It's the same thing. Everyone knows everything about everybody.
Exactly. So it's exactly the same. It's the same analogy. So I think it was using that backdrop to illustrate Podrick going out of character, and that's why he said the line.
Yeah, fair enough.
It was actually a very interesting scene, but I think those two,
That was kind of
it
the
kind of
takeaway.
tied. It tied, and I think, you know, he's known him for decades. We only get a snapshot of this friendship, but he's known him forever, and so I think I could think of situations that if like I had friends that did something out of character, I also would say something similar. Like, that's very out of character.
It's very interesting.
Yeah. Yeah, very interesting. Like, what's going on here? You know. So yeah, I think like that was why he said that line. It's interesting that like throughout the film, I know that that's maybe the next. I want to go to the sister first, but maybe we'll go to.
No, you can go to the sister. That's fine.
But I'm on this track with Calm now, so
All
we go to Calm real quick. What did you think of like his excuse of why to end the friendship? That one I feel like is a good topic to discuss.
I mean, it was cold, right? And I don't know if it was, I guess, hard for me to totally empathize with. I think to a degree, right? And I guess like what was interesting with this movie is it made me kind of reflect on, my friendships or like kind of my life in a way. You do, and I'm sure you've had this too, where you were close with people at one point, but for whatever reason, I don't know if you fully, how do you say this, or like I guess how do I phrase this? I don't know if you fully make the conscious decision to like not be friends, but over time you kind of grow apart or things like that. I've never had this decision where it's like one day like I'm friends with someone, next they're like, nah, you're too well. Not that you're too dull, but I don't necessarily agree with your lifestyles, and so like honestly, like friendships fade in that way. I thought it was very superficial because Podrick was just, in his case with their friendship, he was a good guy. He was a good friend to Colm. It's just that Colm thought he was just stupid or didn't really add any value to his life in a way. But honestly, like it was very short-sighted, I would say, of him, because Podrick was probably the friend or the person in his life that cared the most about him, whether Colm could see it or not. And so it was kind of tragic to see him just throw it away like that because he thought he was too dumb to really contribute to anything of substance to Colm's life. So I thought it was interesting because as smart as Colm is, I think he was too short-sighted in many ways to see some of those aspects.
The thing is that I walk away thinking that Calm is not that smart, because one thing is that
which we know people like this. I'm sure people, they think they're really smart. And it's like, it's silly how like you don't quite see how in many ways you're not.
Yeah, I mean, to your point, like, when people, let's say friendships, I was using the term fade, it's because you either move jobs, you move cities, you move colleges.
Well, I'll say this: it's like there's people who like you're close with in high school, but it's like they either didn't grow up or they have certain lifestyles that you don't necessarily agree with or just don't really vibe with, and you kind of grow apart.
Yep, exactly. And it's just I think that's a common one. I think another one is just like their life went a certain way. They had maybe kids at 24, 25, and you're still
sure, yeah. Just have
like those things
like that.
Yeah, that happens too. So like I think there's a mix of reasons. So I think that's important to just raise. But with Calm's character, it was clearly that, and the sister called him out on it. Like, it's clearly because he's narcissistic. His excuse of why he was not this great whatever thinker, musician, it was because of his friendship with
yeah, it's like that's not the reason, bro.
Yeah, that's not exactly. It's like saying like, the reason I'm not rich is all my friends. It's like, I'm pretty sure.
But we know people who always blame others for like things that didn't go right in their lives.
Yeah, there's always people.
A lot of people like that.
Yeah, it's always easier to blame others. Yeah. It's the Rene Girard says it's the scapegoat. His scapegoat theory that he wrote in the 80s and 90s. That like in the end, people it was about the society, but I'm going to use this as the individual. So much easier when somebody can just be like, oh, all the faults are because of this external reasons.
Yeah, well, it's so funny. It's like
But it is tricky because, like, when I think of The Wire, I do think there's a gray area with that. But there is a point where, especially with this film, where this is why I do like this backdrop, is that it made it clear that, like, no, calm, you're the reason why you're.
Yeah,
you're in this.
like we could talk about societal pressures for certain things or why they are, but I think more it's like, and probably the best example you can give for something that's kind of more mainstream is just an Abba and Preach report on this all the time. You see kind of like the downfall of like really like, which we make fun of all the time, like Fresh and Fit. Every time they're arguing about something that goes wrong, it's always society, it's Big Brother, or in their latest iteration, it was the co-host blaming one another. And the co-host who does the most extreme things was saying, no, it was the other dude's fault. Like he did this, and not wanting to look internal at all the stupid things and decisions he's done. And more my point, it's like and that's, I could think of that, and I don't want to say anything, but with people in my personal life that do that, and it's like, dude, like, how do you not see like you're the cause of like most of your problems? It's not anybody else. It's not your family. It's like you and your decisions. And I think that's kind of what they were trying to show. But Colin is too egotistical to kind of realize.
Yeah, he's too egotistical to realize. And actually, when you bring up Abba and Preach, I came across this is an older.
I think that's why, like, contrasting that. That's why, like, Abba is he's just very self-aware.
Yeah,
and not a lot of like reflecting on many things in his life. At least that's how it comes across. I don't know him personally.
Yeah, but they did a video about it was 9 months ago. They did a video. I watched it recently because I guess it goes recommended.
What are you talking about?
It's this Australian OnlyFans girl that is, her goal is to sleep with 300 people. And what was interesting in that video is that, okay, fine, you want to do this, you want to make money. She's super hot. She even says she only wants to do the 300 with 7 out of 10s or above or whatever. But then she's in this interview where she says that, oh yeah, she would settle with the right dude. And if they don't want to settle with me, it's because of misogyny. It's like, I would picture her like, what are you talking about? like that's not the reason. Like, it's just, I don't know. Like, people don't want to. Sometimes people say that's been with 300 people. I don't know. Like, it's kind of weird, you know. Like, and
well, I think it's because like a lot of people have issue with that because you're not. It's not like you're trying to. How do I say this? It's not necessarily the number, it's just the reasons, or you're just not being careful in kind of like who you're choosing to see. It's like very superficial. It's not like you're going through the process, developing like strong relations with that possibility. It's just like you're just kind of going and not really having the highest standards with who you're choosing to engage with, if that makes sense. I think that turns a lot of, I don't know.
For me, dude, the number, bro, I'm like, I'm good, dude. Like,
yeah, but it's also like the mentality with which you're going with, I guess, is my point. Like, you can't say like, I'm just gonna sleep with someone just because of how they look superficially, and then be like, but I'll settle down for the right person. And it's like you're in one approach, you're going for like total superficiality, and then you're not really looking for things that you necessarily want with someone long term, and then conflate that. It's like you're wanting two different things at the same time, and it's just like that's not how things work. You're not actively working towards that.
And I don't know anything about this chick, so for all I know, like, she filmed some of these too for her OnlyFans account. So it's like, okay, like, I'm good, like, you could be a supermodel, I'm good, dude. Like, I'm gonna step away.
But like going like forward with even like other Ab and Preach content, I think that's what they respond on, things that are like more interesting or a lot of other people don't really cover. They've made like quite a few videos reacting to really dudes who are like in their late 30s to 40s and 50s who will talk about how they're lonely. And it's I don't know if you've seen any, but it's really interesting. It's like some dude who's like 40, like, yeah, he's like, I've always, and I'll send this to you after. I've had like a tough time connecting. He's like, I've had some relations, but like I'm like 45, 46.
Oh, there was a recent one they did. I think I saw that.
Yeah. It was pretty good and pretty interesting and what they're commenting. But I think it's a bigger problem within society that doesn't really get talked about. Right.
I have to say a criticism. I saw the video and I was like, the guy needs to man up.
Sorry, I mean, yeah.
Criticism has to come out.
Hold on. In many ways, what they talk about is like a lot of things that his issues were kind of self-caused. I think he, in reflection, he did reflect on that, but it doesn't take it away from the fact that in the end, like, there's a lot of issues with even males retaining friends and things like that, and that doesn't really get mentioned quite a bit.
That's true, because there's that funny SNL skit about male friendships where it's like
Yeah,
the
no,
wife.
you've talked about this many times.
I love it because it's so true. It's like
Yeah.
they're just talking about like random stuff, and it's like, and women are always confused. How could they just talk about random stuff? Because I have noticed is like girls, they feel more connections when like they feel like there's like something like in common somehow with the other person, especially with dudes. They always conflate that. For me, it's like, okay, yeah.
But that's the whole thing. Like, I mean, Patrice O'Neal had that, and I'm sure you saw some clips of him. He's an old
Legend.
comedian, actually.
Legend.
He had that old bit, and he's like, yeah, he's like basically, he's like, men could talk about like stupid things for an hour that would just blow women's brains at how dumb the conversation can be. And I remember his whole adage was, he's like, hey, bro, like, he's like, this is a hypothetical situation. Could you ever sleep with a woman who didn't have a nose? And he's like, and me and my friends would be talking about that for 2 hours. And I'm like, yeah, that's probably true. Like, I've heard like similarly dumb conversations.
But it shows you how like we're still the same species, because a Family Guy had a little clip which was super funny. Maybe if I can find, I don't know if I can find it again.
Yeah.
But it was basically like Peter's wife is trapped by, she's being attacked in the zoo by gorillas. And she's like, what do I do, Peter? And Peter's like, oh, just tell him about your dream that you had last night. And it's like, typical convoluted. I've been there where like I'm hearing about the chick's dream, and I'm like, what's going on? You're like, oh, it was weird. Like she starts going on about like the kitchen was the bedroom, and we had these colors, and the gorilla
walks away.
Yeah, they walk away. They get bored, and all the dudes start walking away. And the one dude's like, hey, with his girlfriend, he's like, can we go? She's like, no, I want to hear the rest of this, and then I want to tell about my dream. The guy's like, oh, great.
I saw the funniest clip where it was, I'm sure you've heard of mansplaining, right? Or that terminology.
Of course, dude. I hear it.
But there was a great one where like some dude's like, all right, you've heard of mansplaining. He's like, but what my wife does, it, which doesn't get talked about a lot, is she elaborates, which had me dying. He's like, she'll be talking about things that have nothing to do with the story.
Yes, true. But I'm like,
I'm sorry, that was just funny. That was just.
But reeling us back in a little bit.
Yeah.
So like, I think you're right. Like I think Calm has this narcissistic view of himself that leads him to believe that his friendship's holding him back. And I think you're right. He's short-sighted, but I think also it's his coping mechanism. And what I think that's another topic. This is why this movie's so good. Is that it's another topic of like people all like, I know that like online people love to rip coping mechanisms, but people don't realize how much coping mechanisms people need to function. They needed to. I always say this myself, right? People believe the stories they tell themselves, or they are the stories they tell themselves. And like, I think Calm is
you are the hero of your own story. Yeah.
Exactly. Calm is another example of like, he needed this to tell him, to be the excuse that he could have for why he's reaching the end of his life and he feels kind of like empty about it.
Mm-hmm.
And it, unfortunately, like you said earlier, actions don't happen in vacuums, even though people wish they did. And it affects his relationship with obviously his supposed closest friend. And then also, I would say still, we don't see it as much, but I bet you the village as a whole probably still somewhat impacted to this new dynamic. Cause like, especially with these small towns, dynamics work, right? Like, oh, this is our dynamic. Now you've changed it. So now Podrick's out of sorts. And now actually that's how we see his impact, is that Podrick's out of sorts. So that impacts other people because we follow Podrick a lot more.
Right.
But anyways, going back to Siobhan, that's another interesting character archetype, because her archetype for me was like the typical devoted female or women, female archetype of like devoted like family member, but also has her own kind of like wants and dreams, and she's tied between, I want to be a good sister, I want to be a good neighbor, I want to be a good friend, a good citizen of my town, but I also have my own dreams and ambitions, and I'm tied to both. I think her character was really that. I think other than that, it wasn't as nuanced as the male ones, because I think this was a very, my perspective that this is a movie really about like the male psyche in a sense, and her character was not, I wouldn't say watered down, it was still really important, but I don't think it was like super like locked into like her perspective. It was like, the main two characters that we have to deal with.
Right.
But yeah, I'm curious what you thought about her having to balance that, how she handled Dominic, how she handled Podrick, and how she handled like, her role in that dynamic, and then eventually getting out.
Yeah, I mean, I think it was tough. It's tough when you're kind of like the. I mean, she's the only family it seems like that Podrick has, and she's the main caretaker. And obviously, like Podrick is very well. He has some disabilities in some way, and it's never quite fully stated, right? And so I think she just feels a lot of pressure that she's had to take care or is always concerned with Podrick, and because of that she's had to like put her wants and needs in the background, right? They grew up in a small town, not even on Ireland, like off an island, off of in an island off of Ireland, right? And that, for some reason, that was very hard for me to say for a second, but yeah, so like she's very restricted, isolated, and then she has to deal with this dynamic between her brother and his lifelong friend that is like causing a rift and making her concerned even more for Podrick and kind of his well-being and state. But at a certain point, all these dynamics and the fact that she just couldn't pursue her dreams, eventually she's like, I've had enough. Like I'm leaving. Like there's just too much that's going on. And I think that it was very hard for her to come to terms with like telling that to Podrick. But in the end, I think after all the sacrifices, she decided to make her selfish choice. Right. And I would know people who've had to be caretakers, and it does put a big burden on them, at least for the people that I've known in my life. Right. And so it's hard to judge her, like I guess in one way, but it's like no matter what she does, it's a tough decision. In some ways, her character reminds me of and I know you hate this, and she's not an enabler in this way, but she reminds me of that lady who's the friend of I forgot the guy's name in The Whale, and you hated her because she was the caretaker and loved to enable him so that she filled that role, but wasn't quite.
Oh yeah, I hated that character. Don't get me triggered, dude. And then I hit way too close to home because I've seen the enabler. I hate those characters. They need to stop doing that. There's one thing to be like a mischievous like I am, an enabler of like the psyche, but like she was really like enabling him like like to the degree where like I was like, this is
Never heard you get so triggered by a character quite to that degree.
Yeah, I was like, I've seen this archetype. I hate this archetype. And, that's why I always tell my
I don't know. But what was your thoughts on Siobhan? Exactly.
No, before I get in there, I've always told my folks, I'm telling my kids, like, don't even enable me. Just pull the plug on my. If I'm on the deathbed, just pull the plug and let me go, dude. Like, none of that. No.
Anyway.
I mean, Siobhan, first of all, is a great name. I will start with that.
Very Irish.
Yeah. I would say that like I agree. I think like in the end, my opinion is that she probably made the right choice overall, because unless the person who is being a caregiver openly acknowledges that they're making this sacrifice and they have to forego all their other ambitions to do this, what ends up happening often, I think, than not, is this person ends up becoming very bitter later that they had to do 100%. All this. Because it's, and I think there are.
I think that might have also been her worry. She didn't want to end up as bitter as her brother had become too.
Yeah, and also like what's also hinted is that she's leaving for now, but she says she'll visit, and also like she doesn't cut off the possibility of returning back to the island at some point.
Mm-hmm.
So it's not like the movie could have easily done like, oh, she went to like the edge of the world, she's really a boat ride away if you think about it, even though it's in a hostile environment. And I would say like I think that was kind of like like I fully agree on. I think the other thing I do want to touch upon with her character before we move on to our main or Podrick is I also, this movie was good in letting me like making me feel the empathy of her situation with Dominic, of like she's trying to be nice to him, she's trying to let him down nice, but I understand now like why, bringing it back to our modern era of society.
You got the female's perspective.
Yeah, I mean, which I've seen in other films, but I think this film did a good, because it was such a good film with like the writing and like the acting that it really, you could read between the lines. But like I you end up understanding why like some women who get all these nasty DMs or they get like hit on all the time, like they're just like, yeah, like that's why I treat a lot of men like, if you're not them, like you you're of that group, I gotta treat, they equate both, right? It's unfortunate, but that's what happens, right? And I think like even though this was like a much more tame situation where he wasn't being like that, but like I get it. Like if I was being like asked out every like other day, I would be like, I said no like 4 times. Like you
Well,
gotta
yeah.
like
Well, you also
understand.
made the that fake Tinder account years ago just as an experiment and got to pretending to be a woman and just to see like the response you get. And you're like, dude, it was unbelievably disgusting. Some of the
Yeah.
responses you're getting.
But at least Siobhan was direct. When I was like
Yeah.
18, I tried to ask out a chick, like I think like 5 times, and she kept saying I'm busy. And now I'm older and
Now
wiser
you
now.
get it, yeah. But at the time, you kind of learn and you're like, oh,
Yeah. Well, it took me 5 times, so I didn't learn quickly on that one, dude.
no, right. But it's all a learning experience. Like, especially when you're young, you're trying to figure things out, right? Whereas, like, if you're still doing that today, it's like, dude, you should have learned by now.
Yeah.
After
Well, we know there's tons of dudes that still do that today because was it the. But yeah, what that experience taught me was that like people, and it's what she's trying to do. They're trying to be not polite, but also like send a message. And so like it's at least she's more direct about it because she does tell them more directly like no and like why. But often like you said, girls will speak in code of like I'm busy or I had a lot of work agreement. And I'm now that I listen, actually one of the good things I have during the pandemic or in my mid to late 20s is that listening to female content, I realized that that's just all their pretexts because like the same advice they say about men of like, oh, if he could, he would. It's the same advice that I would hold to a guy to hold the girl accountable. It's like, well, they say this about guys, so she wanted to, she would. She would reply. She wouldn't just like, left you on read, like that's the truth, it's everybody's psyche. So like any human, not just male or male, female, like I've learned over time that like, even if they're like, they do one thing that might seem like vain, like show interest, it was a guy or a girl, like in the end, like you just don't know what's going on in their head. Like maybe they're kind of intrigued by your life, but they don't really want to be with you. Like it's just like a whole mixed bag, right?
Sure.
Maybe they're just lonely in a certain moment and like, they're interested in you then, but then like, things change, it's like, it's super fascinating, the human psyche, which is why I always like studying it. But I just want to touch upon that fact because I think like if you flip the perspective, because we talked about Dominic's perspective, like why he felt like he had to keep doing it. Like on Siobhan's side, she also felt trapped because she's like, I'm trying to let this guy down nicely, but like it's just not registering,
Yeah, and then finally she has to be firm.
Yeah. Which is what I think most guys in the end just need is to be told firmly. Because I just don't think most guys, especially now with social media and texting, I just don't think guys are really that good. I include myself in that group. Like we're not that good with reading between the lines. Like, we're just like,
it's a little blurred or hard in certain situations.
I think you're way better than I am because I'm in situations where like people are like, "Oh, didn't you get the vibes there?" I was like, I didn't see anything. Like I'm just like I'm locked in, dude.
A lot of it is like I don't know. It's subtle things, which is hard. Well, it's hard to pick up on sometimes. A lot of times. And it's like it's a lot of it is like silly. It's like if you really like what they do, either gender, like feeling like make it a little apparent. Like don't assume that like this XY, especially like what a lot of females do with the little like flirty things that are so subtle that it's like most dudes are not going to pick up on that. If you're really interested in somebody, it's like just be a little more upfront or approach.
I think dudes, I was watching some old 50s videos of like courtship by coincidence, not recently, but months ago. And I realized that I think guys way back because guys, I think one thing maybe our modern society has failed is that we don't do enough like mixers at a younger age. What I was picking up is that like they had like these bi-weekly mix, at least in this video, they were doing like bi-weekly mixers.
Yeah, I mean, like
and it was a different society, but like because they intermingled more, I noticed that like they were more in tune with this than I think our generation.
But I think back in the day, like people were also more religious, so you'd have like your a lot of people would meet people through church or like your local community events, things like that. I think part of the we're gonna go on a big tangent. I think a big issue that we have today is just a lot of people are looking for things or looking for traits in others that are more superficial and just won't necessarily lead to like your happiness kind of long term, right? In some of the dating scene as well.
Yeah, but I push back a little bit because when I read like old, like, 18th century, 17th century, people were like, it was actually superficial in many ways. They were just trying to like survive. Like, I think the term survival means differently to our
Sure,
modern
yeah,
society.
you're trying to live, have a family, and actually be able to not die by the time you're 30.
And also like, and also like classism, like, and this is a different perspective each, because like if you're poor in like the whatever 1850s, you're thinking more pragmatically, right? So like,
Mhm.
I remember this one line I read in a book where it was like, oh, he's not that ugly. But he's, is that enough? And they're like, well, did you find everything unappealing? No, that might be enough. And then like the rich people would be looking at, youth and splendor and like, you know how it is. We have these old kings marrying like 18-year-olds. So, and so I actually think that in many ways that hasn't changed, but just how we manifest it is. I think what's different is that
Some of it,
before.
yeah. Go
No,
ahead.
but I think of course there has to been some change because technology changes. But I think before even, but let's say before the modern computer, right? Like even if you were like these different classes, you were forced to socialize with the other gender for like, in the neighborhood and church, to your point. If you think about the modern society now, we really do segregate really a lot throughout the
But I
whole
guess that's
system.
my point. It's like back in the 40s, like you could make a good living and be okay, like marrying a plumber. Whereas today, even though like I've noticed this, I'm sure you have too, like people tend to have a stigma against kind of blue collar work that's well paying in terms of some of their dating prospects. And like I think it's some of that superficiality, which is a little odd to me in some ways, that like you're like what you're looking for in your partner isn't necessarily what will bring you like the most happiness. And this goes both ways. Like you hear dudes talk about
Hey,
stupid things too. It's like that doesn't really matter at the end. It's not gonna like make you happy in your marriage. Anyway,
exactly.
sorry. That's
I'm
a
all,
big
I'm all for the waitress. Let's go. Yeah, that's
yeah,
my thing.
but you get my point. It's like, what are your like? Some people. Oh my gosh, this is triggering me. I know someone. She had a list, and she was like in her late 30s. She had a list of. I swear to God, she broke it out when we were reading it. It was 40 things long that you wanted in her partner. It's like, dude, 40 things is great. And she was, and I was like, some of it was like the silliest things, and I'm like, does this really matter? Kind of long term into it. Like obviously she's the most extreme example I could think of, but I remember just being blown away. I think subconsciously like everyone has a list, but you got to nail down like the top 5 most important things that you want. Like
Yeah,
and
that's
you're not going
I
to
do
hit
agree.
40 was
I,
insane.
I do agree with that. And I think remember we did the film 500 Days of Summer, which is
Yeah.
underrated film, and like one of the main character's friends says like, I love my girlfriend because she's real. I didn't make her up. Like I think the problem with all these lists, whether it's a guy or girl, I think girls are unfortunately more egregious on that particular stereotype, is that you're creating somebody that honestly probably doesn't exist,
Mm-hmm.
right? Because you can't make people
No,
exist the way
even if
you
you
want.
find them, there's going to be some other thing that you've added to your list that will knock them out.
Exactly. Like I think what I've learned, and I think this is like one of the cool things about when I, lived in Jersey, but also New York, is that like I meet so many people that like, and unfortunately, they're not all like super long running friendships, because New York I think that's why New York dating is also hard, is because like everybody just meets so many people. And so you're always like, is the grass always greener? But removing the dating scene, like just even like general people that I've either met through salsa class, through work,
Mm-hmm.
through like sports, is that I couldn't imagine, like I couldn't design these people. Like these people had their own life experiences, their own backgrounds. And I think the problem with all these lists that this person you're describing has is that she's trying to design somebody that, again, like
You're trying to tailor made it.
it just doesn't exist. They don't exist, because you're gonna have to find somebody that literally fits all these requirements. So they have to have like come from this unique. The origin. She should start designing the origin story for this person, because that's how she's gonna know if they make the list. Like, geez, like you can't create that story. Like you don't know. Like all the like I meet people from like Pittsburgh, from like Florida, and like it's just so unique how like the way they grew up and their background, their culture. Like that's what made them who they are. And it's the same thing with you and I. And that's why I do think like I do agree with this one dating podcast that I don't listen to, but she has a kid and now sounds more reasonable. It's almost like Whitney Cummings. She had a kid and now she's like smarter. I'm like, see,
She
yeah.
actually got some perspective and kind of understood.
I love it. I love when people can grow, dude. But she said on this podcast that like you have to like be friends. This is really a dating podcast, but I'll use the term friends or dating. You got to take them as who they are, not who they can be or who they were, because like that's just so hypothetical. You don't know what they'll develop into, and maybe the person they were is not the person they are today, right? Like,
Yeah.
and
Oh my
like,
God. Hey, go ahead and finish. I got something
and
to say.
and I was just like, wow, like I listened to a lot of this, let's just say, underwhelming woman podcasts, and for once I'm like blown away. Like, oh, this is why I get these little nuggets.
Dude, this like triggered me. Actually, yeah, dude, this is so funny because yesterday on Instagram, there's someone I know down here. She posted her story, and it was like it had the caption. It was like a heartbreak song that was posted from like Taylor Swift that she was listening to, and it said something like on the long lines of no longer I'm gonna fix this like broken man era. And I was like, it's so funny because it's the typical cliche of like, the girl is like, oh, he's gonna change for me. It's like it was one of the like, I was like, oh, here we go. But I was like, I feel like this person's gonna repeat the same things. But yeah, you're right. Like you're like not really gonna change. You have to tell them kind of who you are. They're probably gonna change a little bit in some ways for you, like as a partner, as you guys like are when you're together. But like if you're gonna try to tailor make their personality to fit your list or what you want of them, like that's delusional in many ways.
Yeah, I mean the fact that you said 40 things, I can't even think of 40 things.
Oh, dude, I wish you had been there. You would have rolled your eyes so hard for this. And you could ask my roommate. He knows exactly who I'm talking to, and he was just like I thought his brain was gonna short fuse when he saw it.
I think mine would too. If you're like, wait a second.
Oh man, it was crazy, dude.
We should be
But
like,
anyway.
you know what's on my list? I should tell to troll. I'd be like, I only have one thing on my list. You gotta be under 30. That would have been mean though.
Anyway,
yeah,
do you want to move on? Is there anything else you want to talk to
No, yeah, we have one last main character.
Patrick, right?
Yep. So yeah, so what's I'll let you set the floor on that one. The most important character I think in this film, but
yeah, obviously, like Podrick is very much your kind of like prototypical simpleton who finds the like simple things just having like your routine, right? He's not totally complex in terms of like what he could talk about, but he enjoys just going down to the pub with Colum to get his beer. He likes his donkey and his farm and being with his sister. And then I think this was like one of the few events in his life where he just didn't see coming, and it thwarted his typical routine and what he had known in his small village in Ireland, where he would go and then all of a sudden his like lifelong buddy just wouldn't want to be his friend. And he's trying to, and he at first he thinks it's a joke, and he's like, you can't just flip the switch. We've like known each other forever. And no, Colum does. And I think he just doesn't know how to deal with this like rejection and kind of narcissism from his lifelong friend. Right. And so it was interesting because you see the progression of like him slowly coming to terms with it. And then they kind of ignore, but then what ends up happening is he doesn't get the hint and call him not intentionally, he kills his donkey because the donkey swallows one of the fingers, which was such a twisted way to go. But that really sets Podrick during his kind of like bitterness arc, where he's just like that was kind of the point of no return in Podrick's mind. No matter what Colum did, he was just basically going to take revenge. And then Podrick ultimately loses kind of everyone he has and lets Shaban know in the letter that basically he's just like totally like he's reflected and he's aware of his lonely, friendless life at that point. Right. And he goes and essentially destroys everything of Columns at that point. But it was an interesting film. It was his character was just very interesting because not only his acting but his actions, and it was just also very just tragic to watch him not be able to take the hint, and also being sad because he really has been rejected by his one only kind of like true friend in the movie. Yeah, I don't know. Did you want to add anything to that?
Yeah, because because we've kind of covered him with pieces over all the other characters. I think the final stretch of this film is what really pushed me. When we get into ratings, it really pushed me into this extra caliber. So to your point, like you said, he The donkey dies out of accident. It finally, I think everything clicked in his brain. I think it clicked in his brain that
Yeah, basically, I think the whole thing. I'm sorry, I'll let you go. But I think in his mind, he's like, Colin has taken everything from me, so now I'm going to take everything from him.
Yeah, I think it clicked everything in his brain that I think he finally, I think, stood up for himself in the sense of like, because I think what, again, lack of emotional intelligence, I think both characters, the main characters have, and maybe it speaks to the male, modern guys, but like, I think it clicked in his brain that like, fine, this is unreasonable. I have a right to feel this way, that it's unreasonable, and I have a right to be angry. And then I think that the donkey dying set this all off in his brain. This is my interpretation. And then he goes, like you said, burns the house. Colm is in the house. He saves the dog because he feels bad for the dog. He's not heartless. And the reason I think this last sequence is so good
It was so good.
Is that like, okay, the house burns, and then Colm finds him, apologizes for the donkey, and then says, "Oh, we're all squared away now," thinking we could just go back. And he's like, "No, we would have been all squared away if you had stayed in the house. If you had,
that was cold.
If you had paid like I had paid, because like you said, he lost his sister, whatever, her own reasons, had to move. Dominic's dead. His beloved donkey's dead. Like because I think in Colm's head is like, oh, my fingers are like my pound of flesh. And I think for Podrick, I don't think he views this as that's not enough. Like that's not really like it's just your fingers in the end. Like I lost legitimate like emotional things. And then I think Colm is taken aback, and I think he tries to deflect with like looking over the island and saying like
the Civil War.
Yeah, will the Civil War end, and maybe it will end and they'll be able to heal and stuff. Trying to use that as an analogy of their friendship. And he says like, no, sometimes you need to be reminded of things that, that have happened so you don't forget. And sometimes it's better if you don't.
So, some things there's no moving on from.
Yeah. And so the last actually theme probably of this film also is like the theme of like, what is the line of like bitterness and that old saying that I like you forgive, but you don't forget. Because I've seen it in, I bet you have too, in like people's lives, especially older, that like the bitterness holds them back. But also I've seen people who maybe should have some more pride and then become totally like a lapdog because they've just let everything go. It is a fine line.
I think we've known both of those people in our lives.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think it's a fine line. And so like, I think it's interesting to discuss. I'm curious what your line is, but I thought that was like a very strong end to the film. I think an underrated strong end to the film, because I read reviews and I don't think it was discussed enough that, because I think there was interpretations of like, oh, now, Podrick is like meaner because of the experience and he lost his innocence, which I do agree with, but sometimes losing innocence isn't always entirely bad. Because like you said, Colm wanted
he matured and grew up in some ways.
Yeah. He basically in his own way stood up for himself in this friendship versus like, if you think about most of the film, it's one direction, right? It's Podrick trying to understand, trying to fix it, trying to comply. When he just said, enough is enough. You made your choices. I've made mine.
Now I'm making mine.
And we're at an impasse, and that friendship's probably over. So the,
oh yeah, for sure.
Because of if you're following the Civil War analogy. So yeah, I'm just curious what you thought of the end, but also like in theory, like I think in my opinion, the last theme is like, that line between self-respect and bitterness. Cause I think that gets convoluted often in people. Like they're so hurt on something that they can't let go, but others.
I never thought of it in that way, but it is true. I mean, I think we both know some people who really just in our friendships and in like even family who are like either just too bitter for and they just can't find happiness, whether it was something that other people had done to them that caused that, or they just did it to themselves. Yeah. Right. I think it's a bit of both. I mean, in many ways, I think Colm's bitter because he thinks that he hasn't really accomplished what he really wanted to in his life, and he kind of blames Podrick for that in many ways.
100% scapegoat theory. Yeah.
Right. It's kind of like both ways. It's really interesting, like kind of seeing that. And yeah, with Podrick, there are definitely. It's interesting because one event happened where it flipped the switch, and he went from kind of lapdog to kind of growing his spine. But in the end, that just overly consumes him. So it's interesting. I guess like I've seen those dynamics, so I try to be kind of like self-aware from that and try not to fall into any of those traps personally. But it was just a good like from the film perspective. They did a really good job, kind of like showing those two lines and how like people can flip the switch from looking or acting one way and then just becoming consumed with the complete opposite side. I didn't know exactly what else you wanted me to touch upon with that.
No, it was, I guess my last question would be like, what is that line? What is that line of like bitterness being bad for you and versus having like I'm
Well, I
calling
think
it
some
bitterness,
people
but
just don't know how to live without the bitterness.
yeah.
That's what I've seen, like personally, with some people. But I think, like to some extent, like you gotta figure out where and when to like kind of let things go sometimes, which I think obviously bitter people have a tough time doing, right? And trying to move on. But ultimately, like bitter people aren't happy, right? Because they haven't really been able to move on from a situation that just like consumes their entire personality a lot of the time. But then at the same time, with the lapdog analogy, if you're like on the complete opposite end where you never stand up for yourself, like no events ever phase you and you just kind of go with the flow, well, you're never going to be fully happy either because like people are just going to walk all over you. Right. And that's
Yeah.
just not good, not healthy.
Yeah, you're
Which
gonna sit.
I in many ways, that's kind of like what happened with like Siobhan. Like she just kind of had a deal and like was for most of her life accepting kind of her a lot, and then finally she's like, I've had enough, man.
Yeah.
She took a stand and like said, I'm gonna do something for me.
Yeah, and this is an
And
under
Siobhan wasn't bitter. She just was like, look, it's time. Like I need to make a change.
yeah, exactly. And I think that's what's that's why I viewed it as an underrated because I didn't see many people pick up on this last part. Because there's a lot in this movie, but like this last part I thought was like one of the stronger endings. I think it's very memorable because like I said, it's superficially you can view it one way, but like when you dig deeper, you realize that it's that Patrick could have made a different choice there. It could have been like, you're right,
Oh,
we took it too
I
far.
kind of asked, or I wanted to get your thoughts. What did you think they were trying to show, or were they trying to show anything with having Miss McCormick, the person who has the kind of prophecies, like watching the final interaction between Colin and Patrick?
I think that ties more with like probably like old Celtic lore.
Hmm.
Having been to Ireland myself, there's the big Catholicism aspect, but there is still a lot of like
The kind of
Gaelic,
pagan themes.
the pagan themes, and I do think like she's kind of like the overseer of the town, and so
Mhm.
it's like I think she oversees a lot of things, and she does little predictions that turn out to be true in a way that you don't expect sometimes.
Mhm.
But I think her overseeing that is kind of like probably my interpretation. I don't know about yours. It's like it's kind of like this is the it's I think it's a message to the audience too. Like this is the conclusion of this story. Like this story isn't going to be like, oh, 6 months passed, they're chummy again.
No.
It's like this is kind of like it's actually it's in many ways it's how like a lot of Greek tragedies end, where like the last kind of lines is like, oh, and the bird saw the broken spear of whatever Achilles, and therefore this story. It's like a very Greek way of ending the story of like,
Yeah, the
with some
Greek
kind of like
tragedy.
like a little random little ending, not random, but like a little like third party. This is how it
Yeah,
ends.
it's kind of like what you expect in a Greek tragedy. I think is what you're getting
Yeah,
at.
yeah. That reminds me,
Yeah,
I still got to pick Troy. Okay, go ahead.
it's a great movie. Seen it several times.
Yeah, I love
Uh,
that movie.
yeah. Anyway, was there anything else that you wanted to add? I think we covered most of the topics and characters.
Yeah, I think no, we're good. I think we get into scores.
All
I
right,
guess
let's go
you want
ahead.
me to go first?
Yeah.
Yeah. So this film, it's a pretty good film. I mean, it's good writing. It's got good acting. It's got great
Do
themes.
you have any criticisms of the film?
I do.
Would
I think my main criticism is some of it's like I remember the main four characters. I know there was other characters, but like yeah, I feel like they could even like condensed it. Like they could have had less characters even. Um, I think also
like
my other
who could they cut out?
like I don't even know if Declan was really that necessary. Um,
Well, Declan kind of severed the peace with Dominic.
And then the bartenders, the random bartenders. I mean, they could have probably had Shaban say those lines. It would have the same effect.
Yeah, but I mean, like, it's not like there's only 4 people in the town, Chris.
Yeah, I think the other critique I had is that I think
you could say that with any film, quite frankly.
They could have done more with Shaban's character.
That's understandable.
Yeah, they could have done more with that. I think, like, I will say this. I actually have another legitimate critique I have is I think this movie is a bit hard to process if you don't really think psychologically, but also if you're not in tune with some Irish culture stuff, I think it could go over people's heads a little bit because, like I said, the Gaelic paganism. I think underneath the tones it's not explicit the Catholicism, but it's Ireland, so it's implied in many ways.
Isn't there a priest there at one point in the film?
Yeah, but if you don't know, unfortunately, a lot of Americans who don't know that at all. So there's probably a lot of Americans who are like, oh, Ireland's Catholic? I didn't know that. There's some Americans that are like that. You're like looking around like, great. Dude.
I know one person in particular.
That's good, dude. I gotta hear about that off camera. But so like they could.
No. You want to hear? I'll let you get into it. This person didn't realize that Vermont bordered Canada.
You must have loved that, dude. Where do they think it bordered? Just New York, or
what?
Where do they think it bordered? Just New York, or
they thought it was above Oklahoma.
Whoa, not even close, dude. I thought I was at least gonna be like, oh, it's just
not even close, dude. Not even close.
Oh my god, that's brutal.
Yeah.
But yeah, my just a long-winded answer to say my rating is a 9.5 out of 10. Like it's one of the better films. I like the cast. I've seen many movies with this cast, and
this is hard for you because you look for criticisms and you were trying to drop it.
try. I don't want to give it a 10 because my 10 bar is like I'm crying,
Yeah.
This movie's so good that I'm like, how can I I'm not giving it like a 9, dude.
Yeah, it didn't I thought the acting was phenomenal. Colin Farrell, this might have been the best acting performance I've seen from. I was trying to think of others. There might have been another film, if I really think back on it, that he could have had a better performance in. But it was top notch. Same thing with Brendan Gleeson. Like the whole cast was pretty phenomenal. The tone and the pacing were very good in this film, and I really liked the. They kind of had obviously they showed Ireland as predominantly overcast, which it usually is. So I like that they kept it pretty. Like muted with the tone of the color scheme, right? Because that's usually like if you go to Ireland, it feels like Seattle when you go to like that part of the UK. Oftentimes, like it's just very overcast and rainy half the time. The other thing I did want to say, I really like the cinematography, kind of showing that landscape of the film. I thought they had some beautifully shot scenes in the movie. Yeah, and I was really trying to think, just like in terms of like any sort of critiques. I think at times the pacing might have been a little slow. That might have been about it from what I can see. I did think at the beginning that, me, I've said this before. I really don't like when they try to like bash you over the head with what they're saying. So I did get annoyed with some of the Civil War analogy like going on. I'm like, okay, yeah, they're trying to show the Civil War as a backdrop to what's going on with. Podrick and Collins. So that annoyed me for a bit. But how they tied it in the end, like I was like, oh, that was a good way of kind of like going back and forth. But it was a little like over the top. So that was probably my only like true criticism. So I'd have to give it same rating as you, 9.5 out of 10. I think that's been the first in a while where we've actually come to an agreement. Usually, like at the beginning, I was like way up, like giving higher ratings to films. And then lately, that's been you giving higher ratings.
Yeah, I give high ratings for Kids, Glengarry, Glen Ross, not Fremont though. Secretary, yeah, I've been on the trend of I've given higher rating. Well, Moneyball, you gave a higher rating than me, but
I love Moneyball though. But Moneyball is like it's just not. I think we both said this in the film review from Moneyball. It's like the film itself was like it's okay. There's nothing like elaborate or special. It's just more the story of like what was happening and the nostalgia of it.
Yeah.
Like that, you can't compare Moneyball to say this film. They're like two different leagues.
Yeah, that's true. But yeah, that's pretty much it for this episode. We've lost a subscriber, unfortunately, but we're gonna gain him back. And yeah, like and subscribe. Please comment. Mainly the likes do more, I think, for us. I think the comments, great, but we don't get many. So, but the likes I know help the algorithm. So, and subscriptions. So,
absolutely. Anyway, well, that's it for our commentary on this week's episode. Stay tuned for next week, and we're out.